I was raised to be a good girl. I was raised in a white, middle-class family, and we had to eat at the table, we had to say please and thank you, and it was drilled into me to be a good girl. Have you been a good girl? Have you been a good girl? And then my dad read me this poem by A. Milne, who wrote all the Winnie the Pooh stories. And I love these books of poems from Now We Are Six. And it's called The Good Little Girl. So there is a picture of her. And so all that time ago when A. Milne wrote this, he knew that we were trained and he knew that it was something funny. So I'm going to read it to you. The Good Little Girl by A. Milne. It's funny how often they say to me, Jane, have you been a good girl? Have you been a good girl? And when they've said it, they say it again. Have you been a good girl? Have you been a good girl? I go to a party, I go out to tea. I go to an aunt for a week at the sea. I come back from school and from playing a game. Wherever I come from, it's always the same. Well, have you been a good girl, Jane? It's always the end of the loveliest day. Have you been a good girl? Have you been a good girl? I went to the zoo and they waited to say, have you been a good girl? Have you been a good girl? Well, what did they think I went there to do? And why should I want to be bad at the zoo? And should I be likely to say if I had? So that's why it's funny of Mummy and Dad. This asking and asking in case I was bad. Well, have you been a good girl, Jane? You don't have to be a good girl. You don't have to be a bad girl. You don't have to choose between either of those two options. We've come a long way since A. Milne wrote that. The only thing that's best to be is truly and utterly ourselves. And that's what I coach on. Thank you for joining me.